Ethan Cole had spent 23 years in the United States Air Force. He'd flown F-16s through sandstorms, repaired busted engines on the deck of aircraft carriers in the middle of the Pacific, and landed planes on runways so short most pilots wouldn't dare. But that was years ago. At 61, with salt and pepper hair and a knee that clicked every time he walked upstairs, Ethan was officially retired. His life now was slower, fishing trips, weekend barbecues, and telling stories to his grandkids about the good old days when jets were his second skin. On a chilly Thursday morning, Ethan boarded Skyline Air Flight 742 from Dallas to Seattle. It was supposed to be a simple trip: visit his daughter, help her fix a leaky roof, and maybe spoil his grandkids with more ice cream than his daughter approved of. He boarded early, carrying nothing but a small leather duffel and a dog-eared paperback. He found his seat in row 14, by the window. The engines outside purred and idle, their deep hum familiar to him like a heartbeat. He glanced out, watching ground crews secure luggage and refuel the craft. It was habit, his eyes automatically scanning for signs of trouble, the way he had countless times before. The man in the seat beside him was in his 30s, tapping frantically at his laptop. "Business trip?" Ethan asked casually. The man barely looked up. "Big presentation in Seattle. Hope the Wi-Fi works." Ethan just chuckled. People these days treated airplanes like buses in the sky. The flight began as expected: smooth taxi, a powerful thrust that pressed everyone into their seats, and a steady climb through scattered clouds. The seatbelt sign turned off, and flight attendants rolled their carts down the aisle with practiced grace. Ethan sipped on black coffee, watching the white horizon stretch endlessly. At 37,000 feet, somewhere over Colorado, a faint noise caught Ethan's attention. It was subtle. A hollow, metallic shudder from beneath the floor. Most passengers wouldn't notice, but Ethan's ears were tuned to aircraft like a musician to his instrument. He frowned, tilting his head slightly. A few minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a minor technical issue with one of our systems. Nothing to worry about, but we'll be keeping our seatbelt signs on for now." Ethan's stomach tightened. He'd heard that tone before, a calm delivery meant to keep passengers from panicking. But minor technical issue, in pilot speak, could mean anything from a faulty sensor to a critical system failure. The plane gave a subtle lurch. Overhead bins rattled softly. Ethan's eyes darted toward the cabin crew. They were still smiling, but their glances toward the cockpit were sharper now. Within minutes, the captain's voice returned. "Folks, we're going to be diverting to Denver for a precautionary landing. Please remain seated." Ethan felt the angle of descent change slightly. That alone told him the problem wasn't being ignored. But something still gnawed at him. A plane of this size diverting mid-flight meant the issue wasn't resolving. Suddenly, the right side engine sputtered, a sound Ethan recognized all too well. It wasn't shutting down completely, but it wasn't running clean either. The cabin air grew tense. Passengers began murmuring, some clutching armrests. Ethan unbuckled his belt, earning a sharp glance from a flight attendant. "Sir, please stay seated." "Ma'am," Ethan said quietly, "that sound coming from the starboard engine? That's not just a sensor glitch. I've worked on these birds before. If you want to keep us from dropping altitude fast, you might want to tell your captain there's someone on board who knows how to fix it." The attendant hesitated. "And you are?" "Ethan Cole. Air Force, 23 years. Aircraft maintenance chief for 12 of those. I know the GE90 series engine like I know my own heartbeat." Her eyes narrowed, assessing him. She wasn't convinced, but the urgency in his voice must have gotten through. She moved quickly to the cockpit. A few minutes later, the captain himself appeared. He was younger than Ethan had expected, maybe in his early 40s. "Mr. Cole?" Ethan nodded. The captain lowered his voice. Our right engine's bleed air system is failing. We've shut down part of it, but we're losing pressure in an auxiliary line. We can limp to Denver, but if it drops further, we'll have to make an emergency descent. Ethan leaned closer. If you've still got access to the maintenance bay mid-flight, I might be able to bypass the faulty section temporarily. It'll hold until landing. The captain hesitated, glancing toward the cabin door. You realize that means going down to the avionics compartment during flight. Turbulence isn't exactly friendly right now. Ethan's eyes held steady. I've fixed jets while strapped to the belly of a carrier in 50-knot winds. You think a little turbulence scares me? The captain exhaled. All right. Follow me. As Ethan stood, the murmurs in the cabin grew louder. The business passenger beside him whispered, "What's going on? Are we in trouble?" Ethan offered a small smile. "Just going to make sure we land in one piece." The cockpit door closed behind him, and the hum of the plane seemed louder here. A narrow hatch in the floor led to the maintenance compartment. Ethan climbed down carefully, the space lit with dim overhead lamps and the constant vibration of the engines thrumming in his bones. The smell hit him immediately, a faint burnt metal scent he recognized from overheating ducts. He crouched beside a panel, running his fingers over the warm casing. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "How's it look down there?" Ethan popped open the panel, revealing a tangle of wires and tubing. One line in particular was quivering unnaturally, a thin mist escaping from a fracture near the clamp. "Bingo," Ethan muttered. He reached for the nearby toolbox the crew kept for emergencies. The tools were basic, but he'd made do with less in combat zones. As he began working, the plane jolted, and his wrench slipped, clanging against the casing. Ethan tightened his grip, bracing his knees. "Come on, old man," he muttered to himself. "You didn't survive 30 years of flying just to go down on a commercial flight." With a few swift moves, he clamped the fracture, rerouted the auxiliary pressure line, and sealed the leak with an emergency adhesive patch. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. He radioed up. "Pressure's stabilizing. You should see improvement on your readouts in 30 seconds. Up in the cockpit, the captain's relieved voice crackled back. "You just bought us a smooth ride to Denver, Mr. Cole." Ethan allowed himself a small grin, wiping sweat from his brow. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Because the sound he'd heard earlier? It was still faintly there. Ethan climbed back up from the maintenance compartment, his hands smelling faintly of burnt metal and sealant. The captain gave him a grateful nod from the cockpit door before sliding back into his seat. The lead flight attendant ushered Ethan toward row 14, whispering, "Thank you, whatever you did, the pilots look a lot less tense now." Ethan smiled faintly, but his eyes didn't soften. That faint, irregular hum from the starboard side was still there, a sound he knew engines shouldn't make, no matter how stable the readings claimed to be. Passengers around him murmured questions as he passed. He deflected them with a polite shake of the head and slid back into his seat. The man with the laptop beside him leaned closer. "You fixed something, didn't you? What happened?" "Just a small pressure issue," Ethan said. "We'll be fine for now." The truth was more complicated. He'd patched a fracture in the bleed air line, essential for regulating cabin pressure and anti-icing on the wings. But he couldn't diagnose the cause in that cramped space. 15 minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've stabilized the system and will proceed to Denver as planned. We expect to be on the ground in about 35 minutes. Relieved applause rippled through the cabin. The attendants resumed service, smiling a little more genuinely now. Ethan leaned back, letting his heartbeat slow. Maybe he was overthinking the residual hum. Then the lights flickered. It was brief, barely a second, but enough to make several passengers glance upward. The attendants froze mid-pour. Ethan's eyes narrowed. A faint smell began to creep through the cabin, not strong, but distinctive, hot electronics. He unbuckled again, ignoring the seatbelt sign. The nearest attendant hurried over. "Sir, please. Tell your captain there's an electrical load imbalance," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "If that smell's coming from where I think it is, the right side generator's overloading." She hesitated, but one look at his expression sent her down the aisle toward the cockpit. Within moments, the captain's voice came again, noticeably tighter this time. "Mr. Cole, could you join us up front?" Ethan was on his feet instantly, ignoring the stares as he made his way forward. In the cockpit, the glow of the instrument panels cast everything in cold green light. The first officer pointed at a set of readings. "Right side generators showing spikes. We tried balancing the load, but it keeps climbing." Ethan studied the readings. "It's feeding back into the auxiliary systems. That's why you had the bleed air issue. It's not an isolated failure. Something upstream is running hot and pushing pressure where it doesn't belong." The captain rubbed his temple. "We can shut it down and run on the left side generator." "You can," Ethan agreed, "but with this load, the left generator will be strained all the way to Denver. If it goes, you're dead stick with no power except the emergency battery, and that won't run your hydraulics for long." The cockpit went quiet. Outside, the dark smear of storm clouds loomed ahead. "Your call," Ethan said. "But if you let me into the right side junction bay, I might be able to manually shunt the overload away from the sensitive systems." "That's not exactly FAA procedure," the first officer said flatly. Ethan leaned forward, his voice edged with steel. "Neither is letting your last working generator burn out at 30,000 feet. The captain glanced at the storm ahead and made his decision. "Do it." The junction bay was even smaller than the maintenance compartment, a metal crawlspace beneath the forward galley. The noise was louder here, the vibration harsher. Ethan slid inside, flashlight between his teeth, and found the culprit almost immediately. A power bus bar on the right generator's distribution panel was scorched, the insulation around it melting. If it burned through, it could arc and start a fire. Ethan pulled the emergency isolation kit from the wall and worked fast. The turbulence worsened, tossing him against the metal bulkhead. His knee cracked painfully, but he kept going, hands steady as he disconnected the failing bus and rerouted its load through a secondary line. He radioed up. "All right, try balancing again. Right side should be isolated from the bleed air system now." "Roger," the captain replied. A pause, then, loads holding steady. Pressure's back in the green. Ethan exhaled. "You're good to Denver." He backed out of the bay, joints aching. But as he stood in the galley, catching his breath, the turbulence hit hard, so hard the floor seemed to drop beneath him. Passengers screamed. The captain's voice cut through, urgent now. "Brace yourselves. We've lost our weather radar, and this storm's worse than it looked." Ethan froze. The radar system drew power from. He closed his eyes. Damn it. Rerouting the load must have cut power to the radar feed. The captain's voice came through his earpiece. "Can you get it back?" Ethan looked toward the sealed hatch, the sound of rain and wind battering the fuselage already audible. "Not without overloading the left generator." The plane shuddered again, lightning flashing outside the windows. They were flying blind into a storm. And Ethan knew, if they stayed on this heading, the real danger wasn't just the weather. It was something far worse, hidden in the dark ahead. The first lightning strike lit up the cabin like a camera flash. A split second later, thunder boomed so loudly it rattled the overhead bins. Passengers gasped and clutched their armrests. Ethan braced against the galley wall, steadying himself as the aircraft rolled slightly to the right. He'd flown through storms in fighter jets, but commercial planes didn't dance well with weather like this, especially without radar. The captain's voice crackled through his earpiece, clipped and tense. "Cole, we've got a wall of cumulonimbus ahead and no way to see the worst of it. If we guess wrong, will be in the core. Ethan pictured the massive vertical columns of storm clouds. Inside them, updrafts could toss even a 747 around like a paper airplane. He also knew what came with them: severe turbulence, hail, and sometimes, electrical discharges that could fry avionics. "I can try to restore radar," Ethan replied, "but it'll spike the load on the left generator. If that fails, you'll lose hydraulics. Without radar, we could hit turbulence bad enough to tear us apart," the captain shot back. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Then give me 2 minutes." He ducked back into the junction bay. The cramped space roared with the sound of air rushing past the fuselage outside. His flashlight beam swept over the panel. The reroute he'd done earlier had cleanly isolated the damaged bus bar, but it had also severed the radar's feed. Lightning flashed again. The plane jolted violently, tossing him sideways against the bulkhead. His wrench clanged against metal, nearly slipping from his hand. "Stay with it, old man," he muttered to himself. He needed a bypass, a way to feed radar without overloading the main line. In combat zones, he jury-rigged fixes out of spare comm wires and chewing gum wrappers. Here, he had a proper emergency kit. Still, the margin for error was razor-thin. He pulled a length of insulated cable from the kit, stripped the ends, and began threading it between 2 still-live connections. Sparks hissed. The smell of ozone filled the compartment. The plane lurched again, harder this time. The flashlight slipped from his mouth, clattering away. Darkness swallowed the space except for the occasional blue-white flash of lightning. Over the radio, the captain barked, "Cole, we're in the outer band. I need that radar now." "I'm working on it." Ethan shouted back, his voice strained. He reached for the final connection, his fingers steady despite the violent shaking. When the cable locked into place, a high-pitched whine filled the compartment. "Radar's back," the first officer's voice crackled over the comms. "I've got storm cells, and, holy hell, there's a supercell forming dead ahead." "Changing course now," the captain replied. Ethan crawled out of the bay, sweat streaking his temples. He staggered into the galley just as the plane banked sharply left, avoiding the dark, churning heart of the storm. The ride smoothed slightly, but the relief was short-lived. A flight attendant stumbled toward him, gripping the overhead rail. "Something's wrong with the cabin pressure," she said, her voice tight. "Passengers are feeling dizzy." Ethan's stomach dropped. That was the one thing they couldn't afford to lose up here. Without pressure, the oxygen levels would plummet in minutes. He bolted toward the maintenance hatch he'd used earlier. The bleed air line he'd patched was holding, but the gauge on the side panel told a different story. Pressure was dropping fast. "Cole, what's happening?" the captain demanded over the comm. "Your left side generator's running hot from the extra load. It's messing with the environmental control systems. If it trips offline, you'll lose more than pressure, you'll lose the whole electrical system." "What do we do?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "You can't reduce load without losing radar. And you can't lose radar in this storm. That leaves one option." "What's that?" "I'm going to hand balance the generator load myself, in real time, for the rest of the flight." The first officer sounded incredulous. "You mean, manually adjusted every time we hit turbulence?" "That's exactly what I mean," Ethan said, already reaching for the manual control wheel. "It's like riding a bucking bronco with a live wire in your hands. But it'll keep you in the air." For the next 20 minutes, Ethan fought the generator like it was a living thing, dialing back load when it spiked, nudging it up when pressure dipped. Each lightning flash lit his grim expression. His arms burned. His hands cramped. But he kept going, because every adjustment meant oxygen kept flowing to the cabin and radar stayed alive. Finally, the captain's voice came through, calmer now. "We're through the worst of it. Denver's on the scope. 25 minutes out." Ethan slumped against the wall, muscles trembling. He bought them the window they needed. But just as he started to breathe easier, a loud bang reverberated through the fuselage. Passengers screamed again. The plane jolted so violently that overhead compartments popped open. In the cockpit, alarms blared. "Cole," the captain said sharply, "we just lost our right engine completely." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Then we're not out of this storm yet." The cabin lights flickered again, followed by the deep, gut-level silence that came from a dead engine. It was a silence Ethan knew all too well, not the absence of sound, but the absence of power. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the passengers. Somewhere toward the back, a baby started wailing. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but tight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've lost power on our starboard engine. We're still flying safely on one engine, and we are continuing to Denver." Safe on one engine, technically true. But Ethan knew that running a fully loaded airliner through storm turbulence on a single engine, especially with the generator load already stretched, was like limping a marathon on one leg. He pushed into the cockpit. "What happened?" The captain glanced at him. Engine temp spiked, then oil pressure dropped to 0. Automatic shutdown kicked in. "Could be a bad sensor," the first officer said, "but with that pressure reading." "It's not a sensor," Ethan cut in. "It's the real thing. That engine's bleeding oil or worse. We keep pushing the left engine and it goes, we're gliding." The captain's eyes flickered. "We've got 20 minutes to Denver." Ethan shook his head. "Not unless we stabilize that right engine enough to share some load." "You want to restart a dead engine mid-flight?" "In this weather," the first officer said. "I want to fix what's killing it before restart," Ethan replied. "Give me access to the pylon panel." "That's outside work," the captain said flatly. Ethan gave a half smile. "You got a better plan?" The silence in the cockpit answered for them. "The wing crawl." The emergency access hatch above the starboard pylon wasn't designed for comfort. Ethan had done outside access work before, but never in a civilian plane with 180 passengers staring through their windows as a man in a harness edged toward a thrumming jet engine. The crew fitted him into a survival tether anchored inside the maintenance hatch. The wind outside was screaming. At 400 miles per hour, the slipstream was enough to rip a tool from his hand if he wasn't careful. The moment the hatch opened, icy air blasted into his lungs. Rain stung his cheeks like needles. Ethan crawled onto the narrow service catwalk that led to the engine's side panel. Every movement was a fight against the slipstream. His harness line went taut, holding him steady against the pull of the wind. He reached the inspection panel and braced himself, fumbling for the latch with gloved fingers. The panel swung open, revealing the engine's oil system manifold. Even in the chaos of wind and rain, the problem was clear. One of the feed lines had sheared halfway, spraying a fine mist of oil that was instantly whipped away into the storm. "No wonder you quit," Ethan muttered to the silent engine. The in-flight repair. The emergency repair kit's clamps were cold and slippery in his hands. He slid a temporary coupler over the fractured line, fighting the wind's every attempt to tear it from his grip. His knee throbbed as he braced against the catwalk. The plane jolted. The sky outside was a blur of gray and lightning. Inside his headset, the captain's voice was urgent. "Cole, we've got heavy turbulence incoming, make it fast." "Working on it." Ethan grunted. He tightened the clamp, locked it in place, and slapped an adhesive sealant patch over the joint. The patch wasn't designed for wet conditions, but it would hold just long enough to restart the engine and keep oil moving. He banged on the fuselage with his fist. "Try her now." Restart attempt. The engine spun up slowly, whining against the wind. The sound deepened, coughing once, twice, then with a roar, the turbine caught. The vibration through the pylon told Ethan it was alive again. "Oil pressure's back in the green," the first officer's voice came through, relief evident. Ethan secured the panel, then crawled back toward the hatch. His arms ached, his hands were numb, and every breath burned from the cold air. The hatch closed behind him, shutting out the roar. The warmth of the cabin hit him like a wave. He sagged against the wall, soaked and shaking, but grinning through chattering teeth. "Starboard's holding at 60% output," the captain reported. "That buys us enough to take some strain off the left." "Good," Ethan said, peeling off the harness. "Because that left engine's been carrying you for too long." The final stretch. For the next 15 minutes, the ride smoothed out as they broke free of the storm's grip. The radar now showed only light rain between them and Denver. Passengers started to relax, though they had no idea how close they'd come to disaster. But as the Rocky Mountains appeared faintly ahead, the captain turned to Ethan. "We've got another problem." Denver's reporting crosswinds above landing tolerance for a single-engine approach. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Then we better keep both of them running." The captain nodded. "You staying up here for the landing?" Ethan sank into the jump seat behind the cockpit. "I didn't fix this bird just to miss the touchdown." The lights of Denver finally glittered in the distance. Ethan knew they were close, but experience told him the most dangerous part of any flight wasn't the middle. It was the end. The lights of Denver International Airport shimmered through the cockpit glass, a welcome sight after hours of chaos. But Ethan didn't relax. He knew from years of flying that the final minutes could make or break everything. The captain's hands were steady on the yoke, but his voice carried the kind of tension only other pilots would hear. "Crosswinds are gusting 35 knots from the west. That's right at our operational limit." The first officer added, "If the right engine quits again on approach, we'll have to go around, and with fuel reserves this low." Ethan didn't need him to finish the sentence. Going around would mean circling in high winds on one strained engine, burning what little fuel they had left. "We keep both engines alive until we're on the ground," Ethan said firmly. "No exceptions." Descent into tension. The altimeter wound down as the runway lights grew larger. Ethan kept his eyes on the engine readouts. The left engine was holding steady, but the right, the one he'd patched mid-flight, showed a slight vibration spike every few seconds. "Cole," the captain said without looking back, "if she starts to go, what do you want me to do?" "Commit to the landing," Ethan replied. "Even at reduced thrust, 2 engines will give you more control than 1." The captain nodded. The plane shuddered as they hit the first wall of crosswind. The nose yawed right, then left as the captain countered. Outside, the runway was a glowing ribbon in the darkness, flickering between view and the rain-streaked windshield. Failure at the worst time. At 800 feet above the ground, the right engine's vibration suddenly spiked into the red. Warning alarms blared. "She's dropping RPM," the first officer shouted. Ethan's hand shot to the engine control panel. "She's starving for oil, seals breaking down." "We can cut it and land single engine," the first officer began. "Not with these winds," Ethan snapped. He reached for the manual oil bypass valve. A small, recessed switch meant for emergency maintenance, not flight. "You open that now and you could flood the system," the captain warned. Ethan's voice was steady. "Better to flood it than stall it." He twisted the valve. The vibration eased. Oil pressure steadied, just enough. The landing. The plane descended the last few hundred feet, rocking in the wind. Ethan could feel every gust through the soles of his boots. The captain's voice was calm, but his knuckles were white on the yoke. "Approaching VRF, hold her steady." At 50 feet, a gust hit so hard the right wing dipped toward the runway lights. Passengers screamed. Ethan's stomach clenched, but the captain corrected just in time. The wheels slammed down with a bone-jarring thud, sending a shiver through the fuselage. Reverse thrust roared from both engines, blessedly, both still alive, slowing them against the wet runway. When they finally rolled to a stop, applause erupted from the cabin. The captain exhaled, leaning back in his seat. Welcome to Denver. Aftermath. As passengers disembarked, many cast curious glances at Ethan, some giving small nods of thanks without knowing the full story. In the terminal, the captain caught up to him. "Cole," he said, "I've flown for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone do what you just did. You saved this flight." Ethan shook his head. "I just fixed what was broken. You and your crew landed her." The captain smiled faintly. "If you ever want a job in civilian aviation, my company will make room." Ethan chuckled. "I think I've had enough mid-air repairs for one lifetime. But, thanks." Homeward bound. Hours later, Ethan sat in his daughter's living room, coffee in hand, grandkids curled up beside him. They begged for a story about the Air Force days, but instead, he told them about the time just yesterday he fixed a jet while it flew through a storm. "Grandpa," one of them asked wide-eyed, "weren't you scared?" Ethan smiled, thinking of the roar of the wind, the sting of rain, and the trembling engines. "Of course I was scared. But you do the job anyway. That's what keeps people safe." The room was quiet for a moment before his youngest grandson whispered, "You're like a superhero." Ethan laughed softly. "Nah, just a guy who still knows his way around an airplane." And somewhere over the Rockies, far behind them, Skyline Air Flight 742 sat on the tarmac, alive because one retired veteran couldn't stand to sit by and watch when something was broken.